Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today, our topic is Heart Attacks 101 Tips for Preventing and Coping with This Silent Killer. This one is pretty controversial. We're going to talk about death, and we're going to talk about a very expensive problem in the United States, a very large problem that is creeping into the industrial world, but really is not something that we're forced to have. You may not realize this, but we don't have to have a lot of heart attacks. And what's even harder for society to swallow is that we may have lost some people that we didn't need to lose. So buckle up and let's dive into this together. When we explore heart attacks, we have to understand that largely in history, heart attacks were not a large prevalent problem. It's not to say that there weren't people that had heart attacks or that there weren't people that had difficulties with genetic tendencies to clot or to have thickening of the arteries or hardening of the arteries or plaquing in the arteries. But generally, people are a lot like animals in the particular feature that when you feed a herd of animals or a herd of humans a certain kind of diet, you can expect a particular result with very, very little variation at the ends of the bell curve, meaning that there should be very few that are super diseased or super healthy at either end. There should be a pretty healthy herd right through the middle. And I know that may not be happy for a lot of people to play with, but the concept is there's a lot of hope. If humans are fed an ideal human diet, they do quite well. So let's look at the history of some of this. I think one of the things we have to do is look at, is this thing just of heart disease and sudden death and heart attacks, is this something inevitable? We're taught in Western culture that cancer, menstrual problems, headaches, diabetes, and heart disease are pretty much unavoidable, and that we have a certain base level of them in culture and society that we have to deal with and pay for, and that we should just roll up our sleeves and accept it. And I'm not sure that that's really true. In fact, I think the literature is pretty clear that really before the 1950s, there wasn't an epidemic of sudden death and heart attack. People ate all kinds of foods in the 1950s. And it's not to say that Americans had a great deal of particular health up until the 1950s and suddenly fell off a cliff. But the incidence of heart disease really, really went up. Now, the diets of Americans and of Western culture had been changing slowly and steadily with fits and starts for a long time. One of those first things that happened was the onset of agriculture. And that's about 15,000 years ago, maybe. So 15,000 years ago isn't long enough to change genetics and to change populations at a very high level. It's enough to change one blood type and to really introduce the latest blood type AB, but it really isn't long enough to change major features in genetics over 15,000 years and a number of generations. So we can't say that humans really changed their genes and suddenly got maybe sedentary or used to city life, and that's what gave them these sudden heart attacks. So let's look at their food. What did they eat? Well, one of the really popular ideas is that humans had a Paleolithic diet, and that Paleolithic diet would be paleo, meaning Stone Age. So that would be, between 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, all the way up till about 15,000 years ago, which would have been the onset of agriculture. So regardless of controversial issues about what antediluvian societies existed before, the flood, we don't really know, but there were some pretty interesting cultures that were pretty large, like the Maya, the Inca, the Olmecs, and there were other folks around the world that shared a lot of neat features about their architecture and about their diet and about their health and wellness. With probably the first group that was historically known to evolve in Egypt with some really bad problems with grain. They ate a lot of wheat, and it was the first group that was really documented with pretty big health problems from wheat. And so Michael Eads talks about this. He's a pretty famous medical doctor who you can look up and study. I won't have time to go into the great stuff that he did. But the idea is people were pretty healthy and pretty robust until they started eating grains and eating foods that were grown, plant foods. Now, we're not saying that all plants are bad or that people shouldn't have eaten any plants, only to say that when there was a huge shift from largely animal foods and fats to largely grains, and especially grains that were ground into flour, it really caused a lot of problems. That included obesity and central adiposity, which is visceral fat, whether a person is skinny fat or actually fat, and again, I'm not fat shaming, there are certain kind of fats that are visceral fats that are a different chemistry, and they're not the same as the subcutaneous fat, and they're very dangerous. So when we saw this emergence of people putting on weight and people having more chronic disease, it would have started about 15,000 years ago, and it would have had big bursts and fits and starts where it got worse in say, Roman culture, in Greek culture, in Egyptian culture, and certainly in cultures that were growing corn and maize and trying to process it. Now, there was a lot of deficiencies of vitamins that were caused by the way these grains grow and how they concentrate different proteins and vitamins. And so cultures would add different things to corn to make it have better niacin levels and therefore better protein levels. So that's a phenomenon that people started to figure out over time. They would eat food and they would modify their diets and they would try to adapt to it. There is also cassava, which is really highly toxic, but people figured out how to eat cassava root and make it into something that could be digested. It doesn't make it good and healthy for us. It just makes it something tolerable in the absence of meat. Further, the U.S. government killed a whole bunch of buffalo in order to control the population of Native Americans. And that's a cultural and political move that is affecting the health of large amounts of people that were put on reservations. So we're back to, where did these heart attacks come from? And are they inherent to the human? Are humans just made with weak hearts and then we just drop dead in the streets? Well, aside from the fact that during the last epidemic around the world, people dropped dead on camera, which may or may not have been real, the incidence of heart attack did happen at a lesser degree before the COVID era. And so that really started in America with President Eisenhower in the 1950s. There was Ansel Keys, who was a very famous fish physiologist in university at Harvard, who published a study that was actually fraudulent, that looked at a bunch of populations in Europe, post-war Europe, and studied them and erroneously showed that cultures that ate high fat had heart disease. And it was actually wrong. It was debunked in the same year in the 1950s, but it somehow made it into policy and made it around the world for most of all of my life and longer. This idea that fat is bad and that cholesterol is bad and that dietary cholesterol and dietary fat and saturated fat become clogged arteries is really wrong. It's never been true. I mean, it seems true. It's almost truthy, like Stephen Colbert talks about. It's got some truthiness to it, which is the idea that, if you pour hot bacon grease down your sink, as the bacon grease cools, it's going to congeal on your pipes and clog your pipes. And then you're going to have to call Roto-Rooter, or you're going to have to clean out your pipes with some kind of a device. And so it seems like it ought to be true, but that's not how it works. When you eat food, it doesn't go into your arteries and deposit. In fact, the fat that's in your blood doesn't go in through your blood to the arteries from within the wall. If this is the artery, it goes in through blood vessels that supply the inside of the artery, the actual deep part of the artery from within, from your heart. And those are laid down through basically a diet that's high in carbohydrates. And that goes in through vasa vasorum, which are blood vessels that penetrate through and supply the inside of the muscular walls of your arteries. So you don't eat fat, have it circulate in your fat like fat globules, and have it stick to the walls. That's a very simplistic explanation, but that's not how it works. In fact, there's something called a glycocalyx, which is this hairy feature that's inside all of your arteries. So if you look at your arteries as a pipe, imagine the pipes are filled with hair. And that little hair, it's not actually hair, but it looks like hair. And those little tendrils that come off the cells provide for a very healthy tunica intima, or the inner lining of the arteries. So when you get arterial disease and plaque deposits, they come from the actual inside of your body, which is the outside of your arteries, and are made from the outside in. And they're not deposited from circulating fats that are in your blood. It's almost like, imagine that you've looked at your blood and you see this fat globules inside your blood. That's not the danger, and that's not the problem. It's not anything like that. It's not that you eat fat and it goes right to your arteries. In fact, if you eat carbohydrates, especially high fructose corn syrup, it's much more likely that you'll have deposits of plaque form in your arteries made of cholesterol and saturated fat. And curiously, the carbohydrates are what cause that. And the fastest way to get rid of clogged arteries is to eat healthy saturated fat. and cholesterol in the diet and to reduce carbohydrates, especially processed carbohydrates. Look this up. You'll find that I'm not lying to you. So we've got President Eisenhower in the 1950s has a heart attack in office, and everyone goes wild and says, man, the president just had a heart attack. Is it going to kill him? Everyone is now focused on that. And then we have massive action by business interests that start to form the American Heart Association and the profession called cardiology, which didn't really exist that much before this time. And so we have very expensive surgeries, very expensive drugs. We have statins, which have now become one of the most profitable drugs in the world in the history of human technology. And this idea that we have scared people with the idea that a heart disease could suddenly take you. And that's in fact what it looks like. There's no warning. There's no lab test. There's no stress test. You can't go get an EKG that'll tell you it's coming. You can't get a stress test where you go on a treadmill and run. You can't do anything that will show you that you're going to have a heart attack that's obvious. Now, there are a few things, and we'll get to those, but there is no single general test that will clearly tell you that you're at risk for a heart attack today. And when it does hit you, it's highly likely that you'll just fall over dead without any warning, and your first symptom is death. Your first symptom is falling over dead. It isn't like you get some warning. Now, certainly some people get angina pectoris, which is chest pains of less than 15 minutes that happen, and they can get a series of those. But that's not necessarily any warning for heart attack. It's a different condition. So there really is no warning, and suddenly people drop dead. So it's terrifying. But the question is it caused by diet? And it looks like the answer is yes. So if the causes of this were agriculture and the growing and feeding of grains and processed foods and processed seed oils, then we have to talk about processed seed oils. We've already talked about processed grains and how imbalanced they are, and how much they have imbalances that need to be fixed. Imbalances of proteins, imbalances of vitamins, and they certainly have anti-nutrients, which are things like lectins and oxalates and phytates and fibers that bind to nutrients like minerals and vitamins and carry them out of our body in our stool. So we have to talk about processed seed oils next, which is the idea that when seed oils are pressed and processed, these are the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, that are heart healthy, not really. These oils are highly rancid, and when they're processed, if you were to eat foods that have some of them, like, if you were to eat some whole grains, or you were to sprout some grains, or if you were to have some pumpkin seeds, that wouldn't be quite so bad. But if you press these oils, sunflower, safflower, pumpkin, sesame, corn, peanut oil, all of these PUFA or polyunsaturated fat oils that are considered heart healthy but are not, you would have to press them and defat them and deodorize them and run them through several processes that take care of the oxidative stress that they are exposed to. And that is tremendous. So when a person ingests processed seed oils that are in tubs or that come in jars in the store, it's tremendously stressful on the human system, on the brain, on the heart, on the oxidative stress system of the liver and kidneys. It's really bad for muscle. It causes a lot of illness. Is there any way to deal with this? Well, I mean, if somebody starts to have a heart attack in front of you, you're kind of forced to be in emergency mode, which is, putting fires out. And, managers don't like that. Managers, planners, budget people, anybody that's really wise doesn't like to put fires out. Now, obviously, we want to put the fire out when somebody has the problem. If someone's right in front of you at the mall, you're going to grab a defibrillator, you're going to do CPR, you're going to call 911, you're going to get somebody there as fast as possible to give some kind of an anticoagulant that will be a clot buster to save their life, and you might be able to save their life if you get there fast enough. But the real problem is what happened. So there is some science of this, and there are some blood tests. We look at LDL and HDL and cholesterol. We look at triglycerides. And right now we consider LDL to be this horrible thing that if it goes high, it's bad. Well, triglycerides are bad when they're high. And homocysteine is bad when it's high, and fasting insulin and fasting blood sugar is bad when it goes high. And it's also bad to have high CRP, which is an inflammatory molecule, and high blood sugar. Those are all not so good. They're signs of insulin resistance, and they're signs that a person is packing on plaque in their arteries, and that they're probably going to have, some kind of widowmaker episode where there's a deposit of plaque. But it isn't just plaque. And I want to remind you that there are methods of detecting hard plaques, which have been there for a long time, and soft plaques, which are a little fresher. And they involve different kinds of imaging, which we're not going to go into today. But in general, a person can do things like a CT scan or an echocardiogram with a cardiologist to try to figure out, whether they're at risk for these calcium scores and if they've got hard plaque or soft plaque. But even if a person has or doesn't have hard plaque or soft plaque, there's also the issue of clotting. And clotting can come and go in waves. And so that you need to pay attention to regarding, again, the PUFAs and the oxidative stress. So if a person can look at these things and try to understand, what does their clotting panel look like? What does their minerals look like? What does their dense and fluffy and loose plaque look like? Do they have a calcium score that's elevated? Those are all things that can really help us figure out what to do next. And then we ask, well, what can we do to prevent and reverse these kinds of problems? Are they preventable? And are they reversible? Well, the first problem is that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the FDA don't really allow doctors or anyone to talk about prevention, reversal, diagnosis, treatment of any disease, because those words are politically owned, which is not science, by certain agencies and certain groups. So, and even the American Medical Association is not a government agency, it's a trade union. And so that is the group that controls medical schools, and it's the group that controls hospitals and hospital access and hospital privileges and the funding of hospitals. So it's very important to know that the deck may be stacked against you, and you have to look deeper under the carpet to see what's going on. So what I'd like to do is give you hope, and I'd like to talk about some people that have done this. Ivor Cummins has a channel, The Fat Emperor, where he talks about this for many years, even before COVID. He's a biochemical engineer that talked about heart disease and all the different ways to detect it and different diets, essentially carnivore and keto and more animal-based and less plant-based diets that can help a person, if they're clean and not processed, and go toward a diet that will reduce heart disease and strokes too. Now, Nina Teichholz, she did a great deal of work on explaining statins and how statins are related to cholesterol and diet, and we may not need as much statins. We may not be doing our blood tests and interpreting them correctly. We may not be understanding the risk of plaque and cholesterol and heart disease at all, and that taking a drug to lower blood cholesterol or LDL may not be useful, and it may be killing us. It may be making us worse. In fact, the literature is pretty clear that for people over 65, higher total cholesterol and higher LDL is a lifesaver, and below normal labs are a higher risk for death. There is Zoe Harcombe, another doctor who talks about all these issues with regard to diet and plant-based diets. Nadir Ali and Asim Malhotra are both cardiologists that are part of the Low Carb Down Under movement, which we have Low Carb Down Under and Low Carb Denver that meet and have conventions every year and talk about these issues. And then we have Marianne Damasi, who was an investigative journalist and science person who studied the issue of the fraud of cholesterol and statins. And so it's very important to understand Marianne Damasi's done all this work for you. So if you don't know about this, you want to study that. You also want to study the work of the Inuit and the Sami tribes up in Finland and Russia and Sweden. I got to visit some of those groups in 2005, and I got to go up there and hang out with some of those people and really enjoy understanding their animal-based diets and why they're so healthy. They're not very happy economically right now, but that's political and not traditional food-based. They have a wisdom that when they were able to eat what they were used to eating in that environment, they did quite well. Also, the Inuit and Sami and other groups that live in the Arctic knew that they needed fat. They didn't eat lean meat. They didn't eat rabbits. They didn't eat lean meat and meat that was very lean. They ate meat that was very fatty. And in fact, these groups would give up the filet mignon cuts, which were too lean, and they would aim toward more fats and organ meats and suet and tallow and all the different kinds of foods that are in cows and pigs and sheep. I realize that some of these animals are not in the Arctic, but you get the point. There are different kinds of fats and different kinds of animals, and people knew that they needed those fats. We know that Genghis Khan's armies were able to move across a massive part of the world and succeed partly because they ate horse meat and horse milk and horse blood, and they didn't eat plant foods. So I'm not trying to tell you the ethics of Genghis Khan's armies. I'm trying to just describe that you might be able to pop your brain out of its restrictions like I have and begin to really question what you were taught and say, man, it's possible to prevent and reverse heart disease if you can look at history and you can look at medical anthropology and you can look at biochemistry and understand the underlying mechanisms. So I hope you've enjoyed this. That is my take on heart attacks in the Western world.